This is the disturbing Japan Iceberg Explained. Tier 1, Aokigahara Forest, the suicide forest. It's 2003. You're hiking near Mount Fuji when a bad smell drifts through the trees. It's thick, rotten, and hard to ignore. You assume it's a dead animal and keep walking. Then you notice a pair of shoes, then a rope hanging from a tree. A few steps later, you see the body, barely 2 feet away, partially decomposed and covered in moss. Aokigahara Forest sits at the base of Mount Fuji, covering 35 square kilometers of dense trees, twisted roots, and volcanic rock. Locals call it Jukai, which means the sea of trees. It looks peaceful at first, the kind of place hikers go to clear their heads, but Aokigahara is known for something else. It's where people go when they've decided not to come back. The forest became a hotspot for people trying to end their lives for quite a few reasons. The trees grow out of hardened lava, with roots sticking up from the ground at just the right height for, well, that. The woods are so dense that once you step off the path, no one is going to see you. The volcanic rock messes with compasses too, which means backing out isn't guaranteed. And on top of all that, it's only about 2 hours from Tokyo. Aokigahara is nicknamed the Self-Delete Forest, and the numbers back that up. In 2003 alone, authorities found 105 bodies. That's the highest official count on record. The real number is probably higher because dense vegetation and the sheer size means some bodies stay hidden for years. In 2010, officials stopped publishing annual counts, saying it encouraged the behavior. The forest's reputation goes back centuries. Locals tell stories about yurei, vengeful spirits tied to unfinished lives trapped in the trees. By the 1950s, newspapers and novels were reporting dozens of deaths in Aokigahara in just a few years. Word spread across Tokyo and the surrounding regions. For people crushed by work, family shame, or money problems, the forest became a quiet place to disappear. Japan's culture of keeping struggles private only made it feel even more like the perfect solution. By the 1970s, searching the forest for bodies had become routine. Volunteers, police, and forestry workers combed through the trees, finding corpses in every state, fresh, skeletal, and sometimes torn apart by animals. The number got so high the government had to put up signs urging people to reconsider. The signs are still there, faded and weathered, and searchers still stumble across bodies just steps away from them. Despite this, there's a positive side to Aokigahara. People go there to hike for fun. They explore the ice caves, photograph the lava formations, and leave. Sepukku. Imagine watching someone kneel on a mat, dressed entirely in white, and as every eye is on them, they prepare to make the most painful decision of their life. Sepukku, also called harakiri, was a ritual form of self-disembowelment practiced by the samurai class in Japan. The practice dates back to at least the 12th century and was closely tied to Bushido, the samurai code of honor. The logic was simple. If you failed your lord, lost a battle, were captured, or just embarrassed yourself publicly, the only way you could restore your honor was to die by your own hand. The ritual followed a strict, highly controlled format. The samurai would bathe, dress in white, write a death poem, and sit formally on a mat. He would then cut his abdomen from left to right, sometimes adding a vertical slice upward. This was meant to show sincerity and courage. To prevent prolonged suffering, a second person, called a kaishakunin, would stand behind him and behead him at just the right moment. Too early was dishonorable, and too late was cruel. Samurai who refused seppuku faced public disgrace, loss of status, and severe punishment. Refusing was seen as cowardice, a stain on one's family, and could lead to exile or execution. So if you refused, chances are you'd still die anyway. Over time, choosing honor became something many people felt they had to do. Soon enough, seppuku became an official practice. Daimyo ordered it, shoguns approved it, and courts enforced it. It was considered more respectable than execution because it was technically a choice, which is a generous interpretation when the alternative was public disgrace or worse. During the Edo period, the act became more symbolic. Sometimes the blade was replaced with a fan, and the kaishakunin would execute the samurai immediately. Seppuku didn't disappear with the samurai, it lingered into modern Japan. Military officers often used it to escape the dishonor of surrender during World War II. Johatsu. You tell your son you're leaving for a 3-day work trip. You pack a small bag, say goodbye, and then walk out the door. Except, you're not coming back. 3 days turn into 3 weeks, then 3 months, then 3 years. Your wife's left wondering what happened, and your son keeps asking when you'll be back home. Johatsu literally means evaporated people. It's the term Japan uses for people who quietly erase themselves from their own lives and start over somewhere else without telling anyone. One day they're going to work. The next day their apartment is empty and their phone is disconnected. Not even their family has an idea of their whereabouts or how to reach them. Every year, Japan reports around 80,000 to 90,000 missing person cases. Most are eventually found, but experts estimate that tens of thousands of those cases are voluntary disappearances, aka people who choose not to be found. The guy from the intro? That's Sugimoto. He ran a small business that failed. Facing his family with that failure felt impossible, so he lied about a work trip and never came back. He left his wife to raise the kids alone while he started over under a fake name somewhere nobody knew him. In Japan, struggling publicly feels like creating problems for everyone else. Asking for help looks like failure, and losing your job means dishonoring your family. So for many people already drowning, disappearing feels like the quietest way out. Johatsu is common enough now that there's an industry for it run by professionals called yonigeya, or night movers, who help people vanish. They show up in the middle of the night, pack your belongings, erase your online presence, and relocate you somewhere nobody would think to look. Once gone, Johatsu often end up in places like Sanya or Kamagasaki, neighborhoods known for day labor, cheap hostels, and cash-only work. These areas are built to absorb people who don't want questions. There are usually no contracts, no IDs required, and no digging into the past. You work today, you eat tonight, and nobody asks who you used to be. Families left behind usually get no closure. The authorities can't really get involved because adults are legally allowed to disappear, so relatives are left in limbo, not knowing whether to grieve or wait. Some families spend decades searching. Others are told quietly that it's, better to stop asking. In extreme cases, families don't even report disappearances out of embarrassment, which makes the numbers even harder to trace. Some researchers believe Johatsu masks self-deleting numbers, while others argue it prevents them. The truth is probably both. Disappearing can be a way to survive and start over, but it can also be the first step to leaving the server permanently. Karoshi. The office is silent. It's way past midnight, but you're still typing, and you know you can't afford to stop. Your shoulders ache, your head pounds, your heart races, and then eventually, it stops. Karoshi is what happens when the work doesn't stop, so the body does. Heart attacks, strokes, even self-deleting from chronic exhaustion. Basically, death from overwork. The word entered public use in the late 1970s, when otherwise healthy middle-aged workers began dying suddenly after long periods of excessive overtime. They weren't involved in industrial accidents or suffering from undiagnosed illnesses. Their bodies just stopped functioning after years of being pushed past reasonable limits. During Japan's post-war economic boom, long hours, total loyalty to the company, and social pressure to never leave work before your boss became normal. Being tired was a badge of honor. Employees slept at their desks, missed holidays, and quietly collapsed at home. When they died, it was often written off as unfortunate but understandable. By the 1980s, the issue was impossible to ignore. Government reports tied extreme overtime to deadly heart attacks, and families started suing companies. In severe cases, karoshi overlaps with unaliving. Workers overwhelmed by impossible demands and constant pressure take their own lives, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as karojisatsu. These cases are often difficult to prove legally because stress is invisible, and exhaustion, unfortunately, does not leave fingerprints. Eventually, the Japanese government decided to intervene and try to fix things. Laws were introduced to limit overtime, encourage time off, and recognize karoshi as a work-related death eligible for compensation. Some companies even introduced mandatory no overtime days, which sounds good until you realize that culture does not change because a memo said so. For many workers, nothing really changed. People still stayed late and skipped leave, all because they feared looking replaceable or weak. Hikikomori. Ever thought about just locking your door and opting out of society entirely? Well, in Japan, that thought turned into a real, long-term lifestyle for some people. Hikikomori is a Japanese term for extreme social withdrawal, where someone pulls inward so completely they vanish from public life for years, or sometimes decades. The phenomenon first drew attention in the 1990s, when Japanese psychiatrists noticed a growing number of young adults who refused to work, go to school, or socialize. Some rely entirely on family, while others scrape by on savings, government aid, or part-time online work. Hikikomori usually starts with pressure, bullying, failing at school, losing face at work, or just the constant terror of messing up in a culture that demands perfection and forgives almost nothing. From the outside, it might look like a choice, but it isn't that simple. Most cases come with total digital immersion. Video games, forums, and social media take the place of real-world interaction. Contact with the outside is minimal and tightly controlled. Meals, hygiene, sleep, all of it follows routines within the room. It's like living in a tiny, extremely strict country of one. Most hikikomori live with their parents. At first, families tell themselves it's temporary and assume it'll pass. Months stretch into years. Friends stop coming by. Holidays grow quiet. And suddenly, it's a full-blown crisis. Care falls entirely on the parents. They slide meals under the door, cover rent and bills, and many drain their savings, or even their pensions, supporting a child who might now be in their 40s or 50s. Japan calls it the 80-50 problem. Hikikomori in their 50s still living with parents in their 80s. When those parents die, the support system collapses overnight. Suddenly, the hikikomori has no income, no social skills, and no idea how to function. In extreme cases, they don't even know what to do when a parent dies. Bodies can stay in bed for weeks, and sometimes the child wastes away beside them. In 2019, social workers in Saitama Prefecture checked on a man in his mid-40s who hadn't left his childhood bedroom since the late 1990s. His parents brought meals to his door every day and paid all his bills, telling neighbors he was working from home. When his father died, nothing changed. The man stayed in the room. Authorities only got involved when the house went silent, and he was placed under local welfare supervision, where he survived quietly. The government and nonprofits have tried everything: therapy programs, support groups, even social coaches who visit homes to push reintegration. Results vary. Sometimes it works, and other times, well... Tier 2. Tokyo Sarin Gas Attack. It's the morning of March 20, 1995, and the Tokyo subway is packed like always. You're inching along through the Kasumigaseki when a man steps off, leaving something behind. At first, nobody notices, but minutes later, people start coughing. Their eyes are burning, and they're stumbling as if the air itself turned against them. That's when you realize something is very, very wrong. What you just witnessed is part of a chain of events that's now known as the Tokyo Sarin Gas Attack, the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in modern Japanese history. It wasn't carried out by a foreign enemy or a shadowy intelligence agency or even a political movement in the traditional sense. The perpetrators were members of a yoga and spirituality cult, or at least they started out as that. The group responsible was Aum Shinrikyo. It began in 1984 as a meditation and spiritual wellness group, founded by a partially blind pharmacist named Chizuo Matsumoto, later known as Shoko Asahara. And like many cult leaders, he mixed bits and pieces of existing religions until the result sounded deep enough to stop questions. Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, apocalyptic prophecy, everything went into the blender. What came out was a wildly distorted interpretation of the Hindu concept of Kali Yuga, which in actual Hinduism does not involve committing acts of mass violence to reset the universe, but accuracy wasn't really the goal. During the Monday morning rush hour, 5 Aum members boarded trains on 3 major subway lines, passing through Kasumigaseki and Nagatacho areas near Japan's government offices. Each carried plastic bags filled with liquid sarin, wrapped in newspaper. They punctured the bags with sharpened umbrellas, left them leaking on the train floor, and calmly exited. The gas spread quickly, making passengers collapse. Station workers tried to help and became victims themselves. Some people walked out blind, while others never walked out at all. 13 people died in total, and around 50 were severely injured. Nearly 6,000 suffered temporary vision loss or nerve damage. Long before the subway attack, the warning signs were impossible to miss. Aum had already been linked to serious crimes like the 1989 murder of a lawyer, Tatsumi Sakamoto, and his family, and the 1994 sarin attack in Matsumoto that killed 8. And yet, the police kept focusing on a local resident, largely ignoring the cult. They knew the group had bought chemicals for nerve gas. Every red flag was there, and still, nothing decisive happened. Why? Bureaucracy. Investigations stuck in prefectural lines slowed everything down. Authorities were also wary of overstepping, worried about violating religious freedom without rock-solid proof. By early 1995, a raid on Aum's compound was finally scheduled for March 22, but the cult got wind of it. 2 days before police could move, Aum struck first, unleashing the subway attack. The fallout didn't end with the victims. The attack forced Japan to ask the hard question: how could this happen? In response, the government passed stricter laws, allowing long-term surveillance and closer inspections of Aum and its successor groups. The assassination of Shinzo Abe. On July 8, 2022, Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister, was giving a routine campaign speech in the city of Nara. Crowds gathered freely, microphones were handed to speakers without heavy screening, and security was low-key, because historically, it had always worked that way. Then, out of nowhere, 2 shots were fired from behind him. Abe collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead hours later. The weapon was homemade. It was a crude firearm built specifically because guns are nearly impossible to obtain in Japan. The shooter was Tetsuya Yamagami, a former member of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. After the shooting, he didn't run or even try to resist. Instead, he waited calmly for the police and confessed immediately, which really ruins the idea that this was some chaotic outburst. Yamagami stated that he did not kill Abe out of political disagreement in the usual sense. He believed Abe was connected to the Unification Church, a controversial religious organization known for aggressive fundraising and political networking. Yamagami blamed the church for destroying his family financially after making his mother donate massive sums over many years, under the belief of securing her spot in heaven. Yamagami chose Abe not because he was the only one involved, but because he was the most visible. He planned the attack over months, building the weapon and studying Abe's movements. Investigations after the assassination revealed that Abe and many members of his political party had long-standing ties to the Unification Church. For context, these connections were not secret. They were public, legal, and largely ignored. But after the shooting, they started attracting a new kind of attention. Hiroshi Maeue. You're 14 years old in Japan in 2005, buried under family problems and out of options. You stumble onto an online forum where people talk openly about ending their lives. Someone messages you. He says he understands, says he's been through it, says he knows a painless way out. When you agree to meet him, you learn too late that help was never his intention. Hiroshi Maeue was 32, living alone after dropping out of university and losing job after job. He had something we'll call a bedroom disorder. He could only finish by strangling people. Years of isolation and an obsession with the mystery novels he'd read since childhood turned his disorder into a compulsion. To get his fix, Hiroshi started seeking out self-delete forums. Sites meant for desperate people became his hunting ground. He'd pose as someone equally troubled, speak gently, build trust. Then he'd offer to help them die painlessly using carbon monoxide in a car. His victims believed him. One of them was a 14-year-old boy escaping family despair. Another was a 25-year-old woman crushed by debt. A third was a 21-year-old man haunted by failure. They all thought they were meeting someone who understood, but that wasn't the case. When they showed up, the story changed. Hiroshi attacked and strangled each of them to death to fulfill his sick desire. He got caught when the disappearances raised alarms. Police traced the victims' last online messages and found they'd all talked to the same username on the forum. Investigators matched IP addresses and phone records and tracked him down. He wasn't the brightest matchstick in the box, so his home and car had evidence everywhere. He confessed immediately, admitted he lured his victims with promises of painless death, then strangled them instead. Said his childhood obsession with mystery novels drove the whole thing. Hiroshi Maeue was sentenced to death, and in 2009, he was executed. Internet cafes. Imagine walking into an internet cafe in Japan. You smell coffee and fried food, see the glow of screens everywhere, and pass rows of tiny cubicles just big enough for one person. Most people think these places are for gamers or late-night browsing, but for thousands of people in Japan, there's something else entirely. Their home. The people who live there are known as net cafe refugees, or net cafe dwellers. They can't afford proper housing, so they spend their nights in cramped cubicles, usually showering with whatever facilities the cafe has. By 2020, estimates suggested more than 40,000 people were living this way, using internet cafes as temporary shelters. For many, it's the cheapest way to stay indoors. You get a small cubicle, a door that locks, and a few hours where nobody asks why you're there. Most end up here because rent is too expensive, and their jobs don't pay enough to keep up. Some are young, some are older, but the situation looks the same either way. They sleep where they can, eat whatever's cheap, and repeat the process the next day. It isn't ideal, but it's what they can afford. During the COVID-19 lockdowns in April 2020, internet cafes across Tokyo and Osaka were ordered to close overnight. When that happened, thousands of net cafe residents were suddenly pushed onto the streets. Because for them, those cafes were housing. Local governments rushed to open emergency shelters and, in the process, openly admitted they hadn't realized how many people were actually living full-time inside internet cafes. The situation can be dangerous at times. Long-term stay in such confined, poorly ventilated spaces can lead to health issues, mental strain, and social isolation. Some cafes try to provide safety measures, but the truth is, they are not designed to house humans full-time. Tier 3. The Kobe Child Murders. You're 11 years old in Kobe, Japan, walking home from school on May 27, 1997. The city's still rebuilding from that massive earthquake 2 years back, but things feel normal again. School just let out. You're taking your usual route home. Then someone grabs you from behind. Between February and June of 1997, someone was attacking elementary school children in Kobe. 2 girls survived with serious head injuries. A 10-year-old named Ayaka Yamashita was beaten to death with a hammer. Then Jun Hase, just 11 years old, was killed on his way home from school. Parents started holding their kids' hands a little tighter. Suddenly, the streets didn't feel safe anymore. Then, the killer decided people weren't terrified enough, so he sent a message. Jun's severed head was left outside the gate of a junior high school. Inside his mouth was a handwritten note in red ink, signed Sakakibara Seito, a fake name. The note said this was only the beginning of a game, and that he wanted to watch people die. Panic spread through Kobe almost immediately. Police opened a full investigation and started lining up every attack side by side. They rechecked crime scenes, compared injuries, and chased down anything that looked even slightly useful. The handwritten note became the centerpiece, because handwriting does not lie the way people do. They were looking for someone careful, organized, and way too comfortable planning violence. What they found caught everyone off guard. The killer was 14 years old, a local junior high student who knew the neighborhoods, the routes home, and exactly where kids would be alone. Japanese law kept his identity sealed because he was a minor, so he became a ghost with a nickname instead of a name. Police matched the handwriting, tied the assaults together, and quietly closed in. He was arrested, tried, and found guilty, but his age changed everything. Instead of prison, he was sent to a juvenile correctional facility for treatment. During psychiatric evaluations, he talked openly about violent fantasies, an obsession with death, and a need to be noticed. He said killing made him feel alive, which is one of those statements that tells you therapy is going to be a long road. Then he got released because the system said he was done. Years later, he published a book describing his thoughts during the murders. Thanks to how juvenile records work in Japan, he was legally allowed to profit from it. In the book, he complained that people remembered the victims more than they remembered him, which is a wild thing to be upset about, seeing how he unalived the child, among other things. The backlash was immediate. Parents demanded tougher juvenile crime laws, and the media had to seriously ask itself why this was ever allowed. Japan eventually lowered the age at which minors could be tried as adults for serious crimes. Schools added gates and guards. Kids were told not to walk alone anymore, and the sense of everyday safety that people didn't even realize they had before the incident quietly disappeared. Today, the killer is probably still out there somewhere, living under a new identity, protected by laws designed for rehabilitation. Nanjing Massacre. You're in Nanjing, China's capital city, around December 1937. The Japanese army is closing in, but your military retreats. Officials evacuate, leaving 500,000 civilians behind with promises that everything's under control. And then, boom, the Japanese forces enter your undefended city. Japan had been trying to expand across Asia since the early 1930s, and they were doing it by taking chunks of China piece by piece. In July 1937, they launched a full invasion called the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces moved fast, overwhelming cities as they went. Nanjing was the capital, so taking it meant more than just another victory. It would crush China's ability to keep fighting. On December 13th, Japanese troops show up and surround the city. Chinese forces are outnumbered and barely organized. Some try fighting back. Most just retreat or give up. The city falls in under a day. Then Japanese soldiers start moving through the streets. It doesn't take long for them to start killing people. Soldiers at first, then anyone who might have been a soldier, then just anyone male. Then it stops mattering who you are. Families get lined up and shot together. Some people are beheaded. Others get used for bayonet practice while they're still breathing. And yet another group gets locked inside a building and set on fire. Women and girls get dragged out and taken advantage of in the streets, houses, pretty much anywhere, and in front of whoever's left alive to watch. Doesn't matter if you're 8 or 80. Most get killed right after. Some get taken to buildings where soldiers come back repeatedly for days before finally executing them. Everything gets looted. Homes, shops, anything with something inside worth taking. What can't be carried gets torched. Bodies start piling up in the streets, drifting down the Yangtze River, and in mass graves dug by people who understand very clearly that they are digging for themselves. This goes on for 6 weeks straight. At some point, foreign missionaries and businessmen who stayed behind try setting up a safety zone to protect civilians. They write everything down, take photos, and send letters back home describing what they're seeing. Japanese soldiers walk right into the zone and drag people out anyway. The death toll depends on who you ask. China says 300,000, but most historians outside both countries put it between 40,000 and 200,000. Japan says those numbers are way too high and has been saying that for decades. The war ended in 1945. Some officers got tried and executed for what happened at Nanjing, but Japan never actually owned up to it as a country. Textbooks downplay it or leave it out. Politicians call it exaggerated, and some even say it never happened. When apologies do come, they're worded carefully enough to mean nothing. China built a memorial hall in Nanjing to honor the victims and keep their version of the tragedy alive. Japan's been complaining about it ever since, saying it exaggerates what happened. They go back and forth about the numbers, about what to call it, and about whether the term massacre is even accurate. The thing is, the evidence is pretty damning. There are photos, diaries from Japanese soldiers describing what they did, sometimes even bragging about it. Survivors left detailed accounts too, from those who lived through it and foreigners who were in the city. Most of the survivors are gone now. The kids who saw it in 1937 would be in their 90s today if they're even alive. And somehow, people are still arguing about what actually happened. Issei Sagawa. It's 1981, and you're walking through the quiet streets of Paris. The air is crisp, and students are chatting as they leave campus. Among them, someone is smiling politely, carrying a notebook and blending in perfectly. You have no reason to think he's not what he pretends to be, but that's exactly the case. Issei Sagawa seemed like an ordinary young man from a wealthy family in Japan. He was studying abroad, learning, reading, and living the life of a foreign student. He was polite and unassuming, and didn't really stand out. But inside, a violent obsession had been quietly growing for years. One evening, he invited a classmate over. Anyone walking by would have thought it was a normal study session, but it wasn't. He got her to come using the excuse of homework and conversation, and as soon as the door closed, he attacked. He strangled her first, and then, when she was dead, cut and ate parts of her body. After he was caught and arrested in France, psychiatrists declared Sagawa legally insane and unfit to stand trial. That ended the case there, so they sent him back to Japan. By the time he got home, Japanese prosecutors had nowhere to turn. He had never been convicted in France, and the psychiatric records were sealed, which left them without enough evidence. The case collapsed, and he was free to do pretty much whatever he wanted. Turns out what he wanted was to become a celebrity. Sagawa entered Japanese media at a time when shock value publishing was profitable and poorly regulated. Magazines paid for interviews. Publishers offered book deals, and TV stations invited him on air. He wrote essays, appeared on talk shows, was framed as a disturbing curiosity, and no one treated him like the criminal he was. Lindsey Hawker's murder. You're heading out to teach a private English lesson in Tokyo, 2007. Nothing unusual, just a quiet meeting like all the other ones you've done before. You've exchanged messages, set a time, and picked a place. It's all routine, but during the lesson, something changes. By the time you realize it isn't normal, it's too late to leave. In 2007, Lindsey Hawker was a 22-year-old British English teacher living in Japan. Like many foreign residents, she taught private lessons to support herself. It was very much common at the time. So when a man contacted her claiming to be a student, there was no obvious reason to be suspicious. The lesson was scheduled for March 26th, and Lindsey went along, thinking it would be just another normal session. Tatsuya Ichihashi, the man she was supposed to be tutoring, seemed quiet and polite, the kind of person who barely registers in a crowd. She had no idea, though, that he had already become obsessed with her. Once she was alone with him, he drugged her, assaulted her, and then killed her. Next, he buried her body in a bathtub filled with sand and dirt on his apartment balcony, before covering it with compost soil. Police found Lindsey the next day after her friends reported her missing. They'd seen her get into Ichihashi's car, and they shared that information with the authorities. When officers arrived at his apartment, he'd already fled, but the body was still there, freshly buried. From that day, Ichihashi vanished. For about 2 years, he lived under fake identities, worked odd jobs, and managed to stay hidden, even though authorities had launched a full-scale manhunt. When police finally caught him in 2009, he'd undergone cosmetic surgery to change his face. He tried to become someone else rather than face what he'd done. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison in 2011. For foreign residents in Japan, the case hit differently. Many relied on private lessons and informal trust as part of daily life. And after Lindsey's murder, that safety net cracked. Language teachers started rethinking one-on-one lessons in private spaces, and women adjusted their routines. Lindsey's case is a reminder that predators don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they're quiet, polite, and unassuming. Tier 4. Tsuchiura serial stabbings. You're walking through Tsuchiura in March 2008, and for some reason the streets feel tense in a way you can't explain. Someone's been stabbing people at random. Elderly men, commuters at train stations, just anyone. There's no pattern or even a motive you can understand, just that violence could hit anyone at any moment. In 2008, a 24-year-old man named Masahiro Kanagawa decided he wanted to die, but not by his own hand because that felt too uncertain. So he came up with a plan: commit enough murders to guarantee the Japanese government would execute him. He wanted death, just delivered by someone else. Kanagawa had been unemployed, failed out of school, and had started spending most of his time playing video games to cope with depression and death thoughts. At some point, that stopped working. Instead of seeking help, he decided to start a killing spree. On March 19, 2008, Kanagawa stabbed a 72-year-old man to death in Tsuchiura, Ibaraki Prefecture. The man was victim number 1, but one murder wasn't enough to guarantee execution. He needed more. 4 days later, he went to JR Arakawaoki Station and started stabbing people in broad daylight. 2 people died, a 27-year-old man and another victim. 7 more were seriously injured. The attacks were fast, chaotic, and indiscriminate. He didn't care who his victims were or whether they had families waiting. They were just a means to an end. When he was convinced he'd wreaked enough havoc, Kanagawa walked up to the police and turned himself in. During his trial, psychiatrists diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder. But the court ruled he was fully mentally competent, aware of his actions, and able to understand right from wrong. He knew exactly what he was doing, and did it purely out of self-interest. In December 2009, the Mito District Court sentenced him to death. Kanagawa didn't appeal. He accepted it because that was always the plan. The court gave him exactly what he wanted. On February 21, 2013, Masahiro Kanagawa was executed by hanging. The state carried out the plan he designed for himself. The victims' families were left with nothing but grief, and Japan was left wondering how someone could manipulate the justice system into doing their bidding. Hachioji supermarket triple murder. You're working the late night shift at a supermarket on July 30th, 1995. The store's quiet, and it's almost time to call it a night. You and 2 other employees are upstairs in the office finishing up paperwork. Then someone walks in. Before you can say anything, tape's going around your wrists. You're on the floor, hands bound, and there's a gun to your head. This actually happened at the Nanpei Owada supermarket in Hachioji. The 3 workers were Noriko Inagaki, 47, a dependable shift supervisor who had only recently taken the job, Megumi Yabuki, 17, a high school student working part-time and thinking about college, and Hiromi Maeda, 16, a good student, active in her community, picking up shifts after her class for extra money. Their plan for the night was boring in the best way. Clock out, stop by the nearby festival, and walk home together. Sadly, they never made it out. Around 9:15 p.m. in the second-floor office, something went very wrong. Investigators believe the killer entered the staff area after closing, when the store was locked and empty. Downstairs, everything looked normal. There were no signs of a struggle or any reports of shouting. Whatever happened upstairs was fast and controlled. The 3 employees were restrained with tape and forced into submission before they fully understood what was happening. One by one, they were shot in the head at close range. When they were called in to investigate, police found the office safe showing signs that someone had tried to force it open. Inside was about 4 million yen, roughly $27,000, untouched. That detail became a problem. If this was a robbery, it was abandoned halfway through it. If it wasn't a robbery, then the safe was never the point, so why bother with it? Investigators recovered fingerprints from the scene that matched a man who later died in 2005. Ballistics testing also linked a pistol seized in an unrelated arrest to the case. None of it was enough to hold up in court, or to even make a proper case. Leads came in by the hundreds, but none of them stuck. Today, more than 30 years later, the case is still open, and the reward of 6 million yen is on the table for any information that actually goes somewhere. Fukuoka City Family Massacre. It's June 20, 2003 in Higashiku, Fukuoka City. A family of 4 sits down for what should have been an ordinary night at home, but by morning, all of them wound up dead. The family consisted of Shinjiro Matsumoto, age 41, a local businessman, his wife, Chika Matsumoto, age 40, their 11-year-old son, and their 8-year-old daughter. That day, 3 international students living in Japan broke into their home hoping to get away with whatever they could find. What followed was quick and brutal. Shinjiro was strangled with a tie. Chika was forced into the bathroom and drowned in the bathtub. Their children were tied up, killed, and then weighed down with dumbbells before being dumped in Hakata Bay. The police investigation led to 3 Chinese students, Wei Wei, Yang Ning, and Wang Liang. They said their motive was robbery, but the violence went far beyond that. As a result, all 3 of them were charged with murder and robbery. The court handed down harsh sentences. Yang Ning was sentenced to death and executed in July 2005. Wei Wei was sentenced to death and executed on December 26, 2019 after lengthy appeals. And Wang Liang received life imprisonment. Capital punishment is still legal in Japan, and although it's rarely used, both the authorities and the public agreed that this was one of those cases that deserved it. The murder of the Matsumoto family made people across Japan feel vulnerable. The idea that your home is a safe place suddenly felt fragile. Strangers seemed less trustworthy. Neighbors watched each other more closely. And the simple act of sitting down for a family dinner carried a quiet tension. Tier 5. Hiratsuka Apartment 5 Bodies Case. You've been trying to reach your son for months without any luck. Your calls go unanswered, your messages are ignored, and you're worried sick. Finally, you decide to check on him yourself. What you don't know is that you were about to walk into an apartment with 5 dead bodies inside, and one of them is your 35-year-old son. This is exactly what happened to a Japanese woman in May 2006. When she first entered the apartment, she first saw Rikako Okamoto, her son's 19-year-old stepsister, lying dead on a futon. Nearby, her son, Minehiro Yamauchi, was found hanging from a loft opening. At first, police thought Minehiro took his own life. Then, they find 3 more bodies, small ones, children wrapped in black plastic bags, stuffed into cardboard boxes sealed with tape. The children were believed to be Rikako's younger siblings, and some other infants connected to the household. Because of decomposition, their identities were never fully confirmed. Police eventually arrested Chizuko Okamoto, Rikako's 54-year-old mother, 2 days later after evidence suggested she had strangled Rikako back in October 2005, roughly 7 months before the bodies were found. There was even a note lying around in the apartment that suggested she'd done it. As for the other kids, their deaths were a mystery. Too much time had passed, their bodies were in rough shape, and some things would never get answered in court. Chizuko had what you could call a disturbing past. She left her first marriage in the 70s, and later she went off the rails a bit, telling neighbors her missing son had been kidnapped by foreign agents. People said she was unstable, kept to herself, and lived in isolation. That isolation may have been why her actions went unnoticed for 7 whole months. The Wednesday Strangler. Imagine if every Wednesday you stay indoors no matter what. Not because you're superstitious, but because you're scared for your life. Between 1975 and 1989, a quiet rural stretch of Saga Prefecture, Japan, was haunted by a pattern no one could explain. 7 women and girls disappeared, mostly on Wednesdays. The person responsible was never caught. Locals started calling the unknown killer the Wednesday Strangler. The first known disappearance was in August 1975, when 12-year-old Tomiko Yamasaki vanished from her neighborhood and was later found in a septic tank at an elementary school. The tank sat behind a route children passed daily, unaware of what was inside. Tomiko's skeletal remains weren't discovered until 1980, next to the body of 19-year-old Ritsuko Hyakutake, who had disappeared in April of that year after receiving a terrifying letter threatening her family. The victims that followed included a 27-year-old factory worker and an 11-year-old 5th grader, both last seen near their homes on Wednesdays. In the late 1980s, 3 more women, Sumiko Fujise, age 48, Kiyomi Nakajima, age 50, and Tatsuyo Yoshino, age 37, were found together beneath a cliff in the same region. Their bodies were discovered on January 27, 1989. By the time the last victim was found, the pattern was clear. 7 women had disappeared over 14 years along the same 20-kilometer stretch of rural Saga. Most vanished while walking familiar streets after school or work. 5 were strangled, and 2 had decomposed beyond recognition. The community realized that anyone could be next. Investigators arrested a suspect in 2002, but weak evidence and questionable interrogation methods led to his acquittal in 2005. No one else was ever charged. Early cases couldn't be pursued at the time because Japan had a 25-year statute of limitations on murder. That changed in April 2010, when lawmakers abolished the statute entirely. Today, any unsolved murder can be prosecuted, no matter how old the case. To this day, the killer's identity remains unknown. Sasebo girl murder. You don't expect danger to come from someone your own age, especially not when you're both 12 years old. But in Sasebo, that's exactly what happened. Before the crime, the Sasebo killer's life looked ordinary enough. She was a student like anyone else, going to school, playing video games, living under her family's supervision. Nothing about her daily life stood out. At the same time, she was deeply fixated on violence and dark media, and that fixation quietly shaped how she thought. Adults tend to brush things like this off, assuming kids that young are incapable of acting on violent thoughts like that. In this case, that assumption didn't hold up. On June 1st, 2004, in a small city in Nagasaki Prefecture, a 12-year-old girl in Sasebo gets a message from her classmate wanting to meet up after school. It seems normal. They're in the same class and there's nothing suspicious about it. So she goes. The classmate had been planning this for weeks. The victim got bullied at school, and the classmate knew that. So she used it to get her alone in an empty classroom. Then she pulled out a box cutter and started stabbing her. Neck, arms, hands, anywhere she could get her hands on. The girl tried fighting back but couldn't stop it. She bled out right there on the classroom floor. The killer didn't run afterward. He just sat there next to the body, covered in blood, waiting for someone to find them. Teachers discovered them around lunchtime. One girl was dead and another was sitting calm like nothing happened. They got the police involved and she got arrested that same day. There was no public trial because she was a minor. She got sent to juvenile detention, the kind designed to fix kids and eventually release them back into society. A lot of people felt like the punishment didn't match the crime. She planned a murder, executed it, then sat there waiting to get caught, and the system treated her like she could be rehabilitated. Parents started questioning whether they actually knew their kids' friends. Schools added more supervision. The media blamed violent video games and horror movies, looking for anything that could explain it. The killer eventually got released after serving her time in the juvenile system. Japanese law protects her identity since she was a minor when it happened, so she's living somewhere as an adult, now under a new name. The victim's family knows she's out there, and so does everyone else in Sasebo. Tier 6, Unit 731. Have you ever wondered how scientists figured out exactly how long it takes for frostbite to kill tissue, or what happens inside a human body in real time? In Unit 731, they didn't guess. They found out by experimenting on living people. Unit 731 was a secret Japanese military research unit operating mainly in occupied China before and during World War II. The unit director running the show was a man called Shiro Ishii. Officially, it studied disease prevention, but behind closed doors, it studied what happens when you remove all humanity from science. Inside, you would find rows of beds, each one occupied by a person who will never walk out alive. Some were frozen in tanks with their skin cracking and limbs turning black, while doctors poked and prodded them before taking notes on how the body responds. Others were cut open without anesthesia, so scientists could examine their organs while they were still breathing. The victims were called maruta, or logs. They were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. Some were shot in the limbs to test blood loss, while others were vivisected alive to map organs' reactions. Outside the facility, Unit 731 didn't stop at individual victims. They tested biological weapons too. Bombs packed with plague-infested fleas were dropped on villages just to see how fast disease would spread. The people living there had no warning. Entire communities were turned into experiments without ever being told. Estimates say these attacks killed between 200,000 and 500,000 people. Inside the facilities themselves, around 10,000 victims were killed. And no, there were no survivors. Test subjects weren't released, ever. A few people escaped before being taken in, and some villagers survived the biological attacks. When the war turned against Japan, Unit 731 began wiping itself out. Buildings were demolished, records were burned, and prisoners were killed. The priority was making sure nothing and no one could talk. After the war, the doctors behind Unit 731 weren't publicly punished. Many were quietly given immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data, because the information was considered useful. Some of them even went on to live normal, respected lives as professors, hospital directors, and government advisors. For decades, Unit 731 wasn't openly discussed in Japan. It wasn't even taught in schools. Comfort women. You're 16 years old in 1942 Korea when men in uniform show up at your house saying there's factory work in Japan that comes with good pay, safe conditions, and helps the war effort. Your parents need the money, so you pack a bag and leave thinking you'll send wages home. Except there's no factory, just a thin mat on the floor and soldiers lining up outside to take turns. During World War II, Japan was invading countries across Asia: Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia. They stationed soldiers to control these areas, and for the most part, it worked. Except the soldiers kept assaulting local women, which just made the locals fight back harder. Japan's military looked at this and thought, let's just organize it and make it official. Military brothels were set up in the occupied territories for soldiers to use. They were called comfort stations. The Imperial Army built them, ran them, and kept detailed records of everything. Each base had a quota based on how many soldiers were stationed there. Someone did the math and came up with about one woman for every 30 or 40 soldiers, then filed the paperwork to get them. Recruiters went into villages with scripts. They promised factory jobs in Japan or nursing work with decent pay. Families struggling to get by believed them and sent their daughters. Others were taken off the streets or pulled from their homes. The women arrived expecting a job, but there was no factory. They were placed in a single room guarded by soldiers. They couldn't leave. They did not speak Japanese, and the military controlled every part of their lives. The army kept detailed records, tracking how many men each woman was forced to see, sometimes up to 50 a day. Some women were trapped for months, others for years, and many did not survive. Those who lived through it were left with permanent injuries, lifelong infections, and in many cases, they lost the ability to have children. When the war ended in 1945, some were abandoned wherever they were, with no papers and no way home. Estimates put the number of affected between 20,000 and 200,000 women. The families who sent their daughters waited for wages that never came. Some suspected something was wrong, while others told themselves mail wasn't going through because of the war. Either way, they couldn't exactly travel to occupied territory to check. Eventually, the war ended, and Japan refused to talk about it. The official government position for nearly 50 years was that comfort stations were private brothels run by civilians, and the women working there were prostitutes who volunteered. The Japanese government claimed it had nothing to do with any of it. That story held until 1991, when a Korean survivor named Kim Hak-sun went public with what happened to her. Then, other survivors started coming forward. Historians managed to find military documents Japan didn't destroy, including transport orders, quota sheets, and inspection logs, all signed by officials. Japan couldn't deny it anymore. In 1993, they issued an apology that barely scratched the surface. International pressure kept building, and in 2015, they tried again. Another apology, about $8 million to a foundation for survivors, and a statement that the issue was finally and irreversibly resolved. The survivors rejected it. They said they weren't consulted, called it insulting, and refused the money. Japan's position didn't change. At around the same time, people started putting up bronze statues of young girls sitting on benches, representing what happened. One sits right outside Japan's embassy in Seoul. Others are in cities around the world. Japan keeps asking for them to be taken down, but they're still there. Most survivors are dead now. Still, many people say Japan never took full legal responsibility. Zainichi Koreans. You live in a country, speak the language, follow the rules, and still feel like an outsider. That's what life has been like for Zainichi Koreans in Japan for generations. Zainichi Koreans are ethnic Koreans who have lived in Japan for generations, many of them since before World War II. Some families have been there for over 100 years. They speak Japanese, live Japanese lives, and in many cases have never even been to Korea. And yet there's always been a quiet line they are not allowed to cross. The word Zainichi literally just means staying in Japan. But socially, it became a label that never expires. No matter how long someone's family has lived there, they're often still seen as temporary, like guests who forgot to leave. After Japan colonized Korea in the early 20th century, many Koreans were brought to Japan as workers. When the war ended, Japan lost Korea, but the people stayed. Overnight, they went from colonial subjects to stateless residents. They had no citizenship and no country to fully claim them. For decades, Zainichi Koreans were legally required to be fingerprinted and registered with the police, even if they were born in Japan and had never lived anywhere else. Refuse and you could face arrest, fines, or lose your legal status. Police kept detailed files on entire families, tracking jobs, movements, and associations. Schools and landlords often turned them away without explanation. Some even had to adopt Japanese names just to live without trouble. In cities like Osaka and Kyoto, informal checks decided whether a Korean family could rent a home. Many carried special ID cards just to prove they legally existed. At the same time, media narratives and extremist groups quietly painted Zainichi Koreans as criminals, spies, or parasites draining society. There was no evidence, but none of that really mattered. Even today, when something goes wrong, some people still assume the Zainichi Koreans somehow have something to do with it. They're usually targeted, not necessarily for what they've done, but for what others imagine they might do. Like every country, Japan has a dark side, and that's what we've explored in this iceberg. If you enjoyed it, like the video, subscribe, and let me know what topic you want to see next.